Welcome back to Whispers of Wisdom, where every tale carries the power to touch your heart. Let's start the story. The town of Rosehill was small, tucked between rolling hills and golden fields, a place where time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world. In the heart of this quiet town lived Daniel Whitmore, a young schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers and a gentle smile. His days were filled with chalkboards, children's laughter, and the comforting routine of lessons. Yet when the final bell rang, his steps always carried him to one place, the little bakery on Main Street. There, behind the wooden counter dusted with flour, stood Clara Evans. She was warmth itself, with eyes that sparkled whenever Daniel entered the shop. Their love had blossomed quietly, in stolen glances, shared walks beneath the sycamore trees, and evenings where the two would sit by the river, speaking of dreams bigger than the town they called home. Daniel wanted to write a book one day. Clara dreamed of becoming a nurse, though she stayed to help her family's bakery. On one such evening, Daniel pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Someday, Clara," he said softly, "these pages will be filled with our story." She laughed, brushing a strand of flour-dusted hair from her face, but her hand lingered in his. They were young, full of hope, and certain that love would always be enough. But whispers of war were creeping into even the most peaceful corners of Rosehill. Men gathered in the tavern, voices heavy with news from across the ocean, of battles, of nations calling their sons to fight. Posters began appearing on brick walls, bold letters urging enlistment. Daniel tried to ignore them, tried to keep his world small, focused only on Clara. Yet deep inside, both of them felt it, the quiet before the storm, a shadow slowly approaching their sunlit days. The day came far sooner than either of them had imagined. Daniel's name appeared on the list posted outside the town hall, scrawled in bold black ink among dozens of others. The draft had reached Rosehill, and with it, the fragile calm of their lives shattered. Clara stood beside him when he read the notice, her fingers tightening around his as if she could somehow hold him back with her touch alone. The morning of his departure was gray, clouds hanging low as if even the sky mourned. The train station buzzed with families, wives, and children clutching tightly to fathers and brothers. The air was thick with tears, hurried goodbyes, and the metallic whistle of the waiting train. Daniel wore his new uniform, stiff, unfamiliar, and far too heavy for a boy who had once only carried books and chalk. Clara stood before him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her heart breaking at the thought of letting him go. "I'll write to you," Daniel whispered, brushing her cheek with trembling fingers. "Every chance I get. You'll have my words, Clara, even when I can't be here." She pressed a small silver locket into his palm. Inside, her photograph smiled back at him. "Then carry me with you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "And come back to me, Daniel. Promise me." "I promise." The whistle screamed, and the soldiers began boarding. Their final embrace was desperate, clinging, as though time might stop if they held tightly enough. But at last, Daniel pulled away, forcing a smile for her sake before stepping onto the train. As the wheels groaned and the train lurched forward, Clara's tears spilled freely. She stood rooted on the platform, waving until Daniel's figure blurred into smoke and distance, her heart whispering a prayer against the sound of fading iron. The journey from Rosehill's quiet hills to the mud-soaked trenches of the front felt like a descent into another world. Gone were the soft evenings by the river, replaced by nights filled with the thunder of artillery and skies lit by fire. Daniel clutched Clara's locket beneath his uniform each morning, grounding himself in her memory as the ground shook beneath his boots. The trenches were endless scars carved into the earth, damp and foul with the stench of mud, sweat, and smoke. Rats scurried between the soldiers' boots, feasting on scraps as if the war was theirs to share. Men huddled together, shivering in the cold, their faces caked with grime and exhaustion. Daniel often sat beside Tommy Miller, his childhood friend, who tried to keep spirits alive with jokes that barely concealed his own fear. Each day blurred into the next, long hours of waiting, sudden chaos, and the unrelenting echo of gunfire. Daniel wrote to Clara whenever he could, his words carefully chosen. He never spoke of the blood, the screams, or the faces of men he would never see again. Instead, he wrote of stars above the battlefield, of the meadow near the river where they once sat, of dreams for the bakery she loved. His letters became fragments of peace in a world unraveling. But in the rare quiet moments, when the guns fell silent and the smoke drifted away, Daniel allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. He looked at the faces of the men around him, boys not much older than his students had been, and wondered how many of them would see home again. Through it all, one thought anchored him: if he could endure this storm, if he could survive, Clara would be waiting. Back in Rosehill, the days moved slowly, each one marked by the absence of Daniel's presence. Clara woke every morning to the faint smell of bread rising in the bakery, but even the warmth of the ovens could not fill the quiet ache in her chest. Her only solace came in the form of envelopes, Daniel's letters, each one carrying pieces of his heart across oceans and battlefields. Every evening she sat by the window with a candle burning low, unfolding his words with trembling hands. He never spoke of the horrors she heard whispered in town, only of the stars that shone above the trenches, the meadow by the river, and his unshakable love for her. Clara read his letters aloud to her younger sister, Margaret, and sometimes even to neighbors who had no letters of their own. His words, though born in the shadow of war, brought light to more than just her. But Clara could not live on words alone. Determined to do more, she began volunteering at the town's small hospital, where wounded soldiers returned broken and weary. At first, the sight of bandaged limbs and hollow eyes nearly crushed her spirit, but over time, she found purpose in their care. She bandaged wounds, read letters for those too weak to hold a pen, and sang softly to men who would never see home again. Every time she pressed cloth to bloodied skin or whispered comfort to a trembling soldier, Clara thought of Daniel. She poured her love into each act of kindness, as though by healing others she was somehow protecting him too. And at night, when silence pressed in heavy, she held his locket to her chest, whispering the same prayer: "Bring him back to me." The letters had always arrived like clockwork, sometimes late, sometimes smudged with rain or dirt, but they always came. Clara lived for the sound of the postman's footsteps on the cobbled street, for the soft thud of an envelope on the counter of the bakery. But then, one morning, there was nothing. At first, she told herself it was only a delay. The war was vast, the mail uncertain. Days stretched into weeks, and still no word. Each evening, she lit her candle by the window, waiting, her eyes scanning the road long after the shadows deepened into night. The silence grew heavier with each passing day, pressing down on her chest until it hurt to breathe. Whispers began to spread in Rosehill, rumors of fierce battles, of entire regiments lost. Mothers clutched their children tighter, wives wept in the marketplace. Clara forced herself to smile in front of Margaret, telling her, "He's just busy, that's all," though her own heart trembled. At the hospital, she carried her sorrows silently, tending to the wounded with even greater care. Every soldier she helped reminded her of Daniel, each unfamiliar face another possible glimpse of what had become of him. She prayed for a miracle each time the doors opened, half expecting him to stagger in, battered but alive. At night, when the world was quiet, Clara would sit at her writing desk with pen in hand. She wrote to Daniel as though he could still hear her, about the bakery, about Margaret's laughter, about the soldiers she nursed. And at the end of every letter, she wrote the same line: "Come back to me. Please come back." The silence was unbearable. Yet still, she waited, because hope was the only war she could fight. Winter gave way to spring, but for Clara, the world had remained frozen in uncertainty. The silence of Daniel's letters had become a wound she carried every day. She still went to the bakery, still tended to the hospital, but her heart lived in a place between hope and grief. Each time she heard the train whistle echo through Rosehill, she rushed to the station, only to watch strangers step off, never the face she longed to see. Then, on a morning heavy with drizzle, the train pulled in once more. Families crowded the platform, holding flowers, prayers, and tears. Clara almost stayed away, her heart too weary for another disappointment, but something pulled her there. Steam hissed, the doors opened, and weary soldiers stepped onto the platform, some leaning on crutches, some with bandaged eyes, some carried by their comrades. Clara's gaze darted desperately among them, searching until her breath caught. There he was. Daniel. Thinner, pale, his arm bound in a sling, but alive. His eyes found hers instantly, as though they had been searching only for her across all the distance and silence. Clara froze, then broke into a run. She collided into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her tears soaking his uniform. For a moment the war, the silence, the months of fear, all of it melted away in the warmth of his embrace. "I kept my promise," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. He pressed the locket against her hand. "Your letters kept me alive, Clara, even when I couldn't write back." She held him tighter, afraid he might vanish if she let go. Around them, the station blurred into sound and smoke, but for Clara, there was only Daniel. The war had changed them, scarred them both, but love had endured. And now, at last, he was home.